All right, so today we are going deep on something that's been kind of bubbling under the surface for, well, decades now.
Yeah.
It's the Kurdistan Workers Party insurgency. And you've sent over some fascinating stuff, including an excerpt from Wikipedia. And honestly, the more I read, the more questions I have. So I'm hoping you can help clear some of that up.
I'm ready. Let's do it.
Awesome. So maybe to set the stage for our listeners, what is the PKK and how did this whole conflict even begin?
Well, the Kurdistan Workers Party, the PKK, it's a group with a long and complicated history. Their story is really tied up with the fight for Kurdish identity in Turkey, going all the way back to the late 1970s.
1978 to be exact.
Exactly. That's when the PKK was officially founded.
What I find so interesting is that this wasn't just some random uprising. Like, there were some serious issues that led to this, things that have been brewing for a long time.
Absolutely. You can't understand the PKK without understanding the oppression and marginalization that the Kurdish people faced in Turkey. Imagine being forbidden from speaking your own language, wearing your own traditional clothing, even celebrating your culture. That's what Kurds were dealing with.
Wow. It's like trying to erase an entire people's identities. No wonder that fueled resentment and a desire for change.
Right. And that's where the PKK came in, offering a voice to those who felt voiceless. At least initially, their goal was an independent Kurdish state. But even their goals have kind of shifted over time.
It seems like their goals and their tactics as well. Something that really struck me was the impact of the 1980 Turkish coup d'etat. It feels like that event just poured gasoline on an already burning fire.
Oh, it was absolutely a turning point. The coup led to a crackdown on all political organizations, and the PKK was forced to flee across the border into Syria and Lebanon. But they didn't just sit back and wait. They actually fought alongside Syrian forces during the 1982 Lebanon War.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Talk about a crash course in guerrilla warfare. That experience must have had a huge impact on their tactics when they launched their own insurgency against Turkey in 1984.
No doubt about it. That period in Lebanon, it gave them valuable combat experience and forged connections that would be crucial later on. At first, their strategy relied heavily on those hit-and-run attacks, classic guerrilla tactics. But as the conflict escalated, the Turkish government responded with overwhelming force, and that often targeted not only PKK fighters, but also Kurdish civilians.
And that's where those accusations of state terrorism come in, right?
Yeah.
The stuff we got it's pretty chilling. It mentions things like enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, torture, even the destruction of entire villages. It's a dark chapter in this conflict for sure.
Definitely.
And it's really important to acknowledge the human costs on both sides. While the PKK initially focused on military targets, as the conflict dragged on and they lost safe havens in Syria, their tactics changed.
Yeah, they had to adapt to survive, right? And that meant shifting to smaller, more mobile units and relying on things like landmines and sniper attacks. Blending in with the civilian population, that made them harder to target, but it also put civilians at much greater risk. And tragically, as we'll see, that risk just keeps increasing as the conflict goes on.
We were talking about how the PKK's tactics, they had to evolve, right?
Right.
Becoming more decentralized,
Yeah.
relying on strategies that unfortunately made it really hard to tell who was a combatant and who was a civilian.
Right.
It makes you wonder, though, how did they manage to keep fighting for so long against a much larger and much better equipped force like the Turkish military?
Well, it definitely speaks to their resilience.
Yeah.
And their ability to tap into that deep desire for autonomy and recognition among the Kurdish people. But we also can't forget that this conflict, it's been marked by attempts at peace.
Right.
Attempts that ultimately, though, fell apart.
Right, those ceasefires and negotiations that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
I'm curious about why they weren't more successful. Was it just a case of both sides being too entrenched in their positions?
It's a little more nuanced than that. There's this really deep mistrust that's built up over decades of conflict.
Yeah.
The PKK sees the Turkish government as just unwilling to genuinely address their demands for cultural and political rights.
Right.
While the Turkish government views the PKK as simply a terrorist organization, refusing to negotiate with them as equals.
So you've got this fundamental clash of perspectives that makes finding any kind of common ground almost impossible.
Exactly. And it's not just about those two main players either. You know, both the PKK and the Turkish government, they have their own internal divisions that just complicate things even further. Hardliners on both sides, they see compromise as a weakness.
Hmm.
You know, so they often undermine any kind of progress made towards peace.
It's almost like 2 steps forward, 1 step back constantly.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. Take the 2013 ceasefire, for example. There was a lot of genuine optimism when that was negotiated, with Öcalan actually calling for an end to the armed struggle from his prison cell.
Wow.
But in the end, it collapsed in 2015, partly because of disagreements over the peace process itself, but partly also because of that escalating conflict in Syria.
That's the thing about this conflict. It's like this tangled knot,
Yeah.
with threads that lead in so many different directions.
Right.
Turkey's intervention against Kurdish groups in Syria, who they saw as aligned with the PKK, that really reignited tensions back home.
Absolutely. And it highlights a really crucial point, that this isn't a conflict that you can just, isolate. It's influenced by all these regional dynamics, by all these international actors, by this complex web of alliances and rivalries that really shape the Middle East.
Speaking of international actors, I know our listeners are really interested in the role of the United States in all this. It seems like they've been walking a tightrope, trying to balance their relationship with Turkey, who's a NATO ally, while also supporting Kurdish groups in the fight against ISIS.
It is a balancing act that has at times tipped precariously. The U.S. saw the YPG, the Kurdish group in Syria, as a really invaluable partner in that fight against ISIS. But giving them support, it just infuriated Turkey, who see absolutely no distinction between the YPG and the PKK.
Talk about being caught between a rock and a hard place.
It really underscores that difficult position that the PKK finds themselves in on that international stage, right?
Yeah.
Officially designated as a terrorist organization by so many countries, including the U.S. and the EU, they've struggled to gain that widespread legitimacy.
But they've also been pretty savvy, haven't they? Leveraging media and social media to try to get their message out, to try to garner some sympathy for their cause, especially among certain groups internationally.
They've had to be resourceful, for sure.
Right.
But the fact remains that that designation as a terrorist group, it really limits their option.
Right.
And it makes it even harder for them to achieve their goals through, more traditional diplomatic channels.
So where does all of this leave us? What are the prospects for peace, given all these complexities and this long history of failed attempts?
It's the question that really hangs over any discussion of this conflict.
Yeah.
Honestly, predicting the future is next to impossible.
Right.
There are so many factors at play. The internal politics of Turkey, the ongoing conflict in Syria, those shifting alliances on the international stage.
So no easy answers then.
Not at all. But what is clear is that a lasting solution, it requires a willingness to break that cycle of violence.
Yeah.
It demands dialogue, compromise, and a recognition that military solutions on their own just won't achieve peace.
Easier said than done, I imagine, especially when you consider that deep-seated mistrust that we talked about earlier.
Absolutely. But if there's to be any hope for a future where Kurds and Turks can actually coexist peacefully, it really has to start with a commitment to understanding each other's perspectives.
Right.
To addressing those legitimate grievances that have fueled this conflict for so long.
It's easy to get kind of caught up in the details of this conflict.
Right.
But I think it's important to sort of step back and look at the bigger picture.
Yeah.
The wider impact of this struggle.
Absolutely. This isn't just some internal issue for Turkey. It really has implications that ripple outwards.
Right.
Affecting regional stability, international relations, even Turkey's own kind of aspirations on that global stage.
Let's start with that regional impact. How has this conflict affected Turkey's relationship with its neighbors?
Well, the PKK's presence in neighboring countries like Iraq and Syria, it's been a constant source of friction. Turkey has launched numerous cross-border military operations targeting PKK bases and safe havens, and those haven't exactly gone over well with their neighbors.
It seems like that would create a lot of diplomatic tension, to say the least.
It does. These operations have drawn criticism from the international community, and they've also led to accusations that Turkey is interfering in the internal affairs of other sovereign nations.
Right.
It just creates this sense of unease and distrust that makes any kind of regional cooperation really difficult.
And it's not just about military incursions, right?
Yeah.
this conflict has had some real economic consequences for Turkey as well.
Oh, absolutely. The ongoing conflict has just drained resources that could be used for, for development, particularly in the southeast region of Turkey,
Right.
which has been hit hardest by the fighting.
Yeah.
It also just creates an environment of uncertainty that discourages foreign investment.
So it's a kind of vicious cycle then. The conflict hinders economic growth, which fuels resentment and instability, which then just perpetuates the conflict.
Precisely. And then there's the impact on Turkey's international standing,
Yeah.
particularly their bid to join the European Union.
Right, that was mentioned in the material you sent over. How has this conflict played a role in those negotiations?
Well, the Kurdish issue has been a major stumbling block in Turkey's EU accession process.
Right.
European countries have expressed very serious concerns about Turkey's human rights record, particularly its treatment of the Kurdish minority.
Yeah, it makes sense. The EU has strict criteria for membership, including upholding democratic values and respecting human rights.
Exactly. And this conflict has cast a very long shadow over those discussions.
Right.
It makes it much harder for Turkey to convince its European partners that it meets those standards.
And then there's the relationship with the United States. We already talked about that tension caused by the U.S. support for the YPG in Syria.
Yeah.
But it feels like this conflict has created some broader challenges in that relationship, too.
Oh, it's definitely been a complicating factor. The U.S. has long seen Turkey as a strategically important ally in the region, but their differing views on the Kurdish issue and, some other policy disagreements have really strained that partnership.
So it's not just a regional issue, it's affecting Turkey's relationships on that global stage as well.
It is, and the cost goes beyond just diplomacy and economics. There's also a profound social and psychological impact within Turkey itself.
Right.
The conflict has deepened these divisions within Turkish society. It's fueled nationalism and intolerance.
Yeah.
And it's just eroded trust between these communities.
It's like a wound that just keeps getting reopened.
Yeah.
And it prevents any real healing from taking place.
That's a powerful analogy, and this polarization makes finding a peaceful resolution even more challenging.
Right.
Because it creates this environment where dialogue and compromise become incredibly difficult.
So knowing all of this, what are the prospects for peace? Is there a path forward? Is there a way to break this cycle of violence and mistrust?
That is the million-dollar question. And as we've seen, there are no easy answers.
Yeah.
Past peace efforts have failed, often falling victim to that deep-seated mistrust we talked about, a lack of political will, just the unwillingness of either side to really compromise.
But you said earlier that a lasting solution requires, dialogue and a willingness to address those root causes of the conflict. How do you even begin to bridge that divide when the chasm seems so wide?
It requires this fundamental shift in perspective,
Yeah.
a recognition from both sides that there can be no military victory, that a lasting peace, it requires addressing the legitimate grievances of the Kurdish people. And that means granting them greater cultural and political rights and finding ways to integrate them more fully into Turkish society.
That's a tall order, especially given the decades of bloodshed and animosity.
It is, but the alternative is just more suffering, more violence, another generation lost to this conflict. It's a challenge that demands courage, vision, and a commitment to building a future where Kurds and Turks can actually coexist peacefully.
And what about the international community? Is there a role for them to play in this process?
Absolutely. International actors, they can be crucial in encouraging dialogue, facilitating those negotiations, providing support for peace-building initiatives.
Right.
They can also hold both sides accountable for human rights abuses and push for a resolution that respects the rights and aspirations of all the parties involved.
So it's a multifaceted challenge that really requires effort on multiple fronts.
It does. And for you, our listener, I think this deep dive, it really highlights the importance of informed engagement. This is a complex issue with a long and tangled history, and understanding those complexities, that's the first step toward finding solutions.
I couldn't agree more. This has been a real eye-opener for me, and I hope it's, sparked a desire in our listeners to continue exploring this issue, to seek out different perspectives, to engage with this material and form their own informed opinions. It's a conflict that deserves our attention, our empathy, and our commitment to to finding that peaceful resolution.
Well said. Remember, knowledge is power, but only if it's used to promote understanding, compassion, and a more just and peaceful world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring and keep asking those tough questions.